What if the most sacred edifice in our town became the stage for a murder mystery spanning decades? What if the iconic cross didn't tumble by chance, but was deliberately dislodged from within? It was a Sunday morning that Springfield hadn't witnessed in ages. The skies were a uniform gray, a gentle mist veiled the tranquil streets, and St. Gabriel's parish buzzed with a full congregation. This venerable Catholic church, standing for a century, was situated at the periphery of the town. Families were gathered closely, youngsters shifted uncomfortably in their formal footwear, and the air was thick with the lingering scent of incense. It was the fourth Sunday of Lent, a period dedicated to introspection and spiritual renewal. Precisely at 9:47 in the morning, as the choir commenced the responsorial psalm, everything irrevocably shifted. Initially, the sound was barely perceptible, a dry, fragile crack akin to a distant twig snapping. However, this was swiftly followed by the resonant groan of strained timber, the piercing shriek of fasteners disengaging from stone, and finally, the deafening crash. The imposing 20-foot wooden crucifix, a fixture behind the altar for years, tore free from its anchor points, plummeting onto the marble floor below. It narrowly missed the foremost rows of seating but impacted the altar rail with tremendous force. Splinters of wood scattered in every direction. Candles were dislodged, and the tabernacle sustained a dent. Amidst the ensuing pandemonium, a child cried out. 13-year-old Elias Moore, one of the altar servers, had been kneeling mere feet away. He was flung backward, striking his head against a stone pillar. Father Michael Torres, the officiating clergyman, was also caught in the calamitous event, struck by a dislodged beam that fractured his shoulder and left a thin trickle of blood down his face. Confusion erupted instantaneously, accompanied by shouts and a frenzied scramble. Some bolted for the exits, while others rushed toward the altar. Several elderly attendees required assistance to rise from the floor. The organist succumbed to shock and fainted. It took 6 minutes for the initial emergency responders to arrive. By then, the church had transformed into a tableau of stunned silence and grim disbelief. "I thought it was an earthquake," one woman recounted to Channel 9 News later. But the ground didn't budge, only the cross. Elias, however, though dazed and bruised, offered a different account. As paramedics gently placed him onto a stretcher, he murmured to Deacon Thomas, who was kneeling beside him, "I noticed it moving earlier, as if someone were pushing it from behind." His words sent an unsettling tremor through the already traumatized volunteers. By midday, Springfield's police department had cordoned off the entire site, declaring it a structural hazard zone. However, within mere hours, engineers from the municipal department unearthed a disconcerting revelation. The central bolt securing the crucifix to the rear stone wall had been severed with remarkable precision. It wasn't weakened by rust or wear, but cleanly cut. "Deliberate interference," the fire chief remarked to reporters, his astonishment palpable. This was no accident. Adding to the mystery, there were no reported security breaches, no evidence of forced entry, and no usable footage from the aging surveillance cameras positioned throughout the sanctuary. Yet someone, an individual within the church, had clearly sabotaged the crucifix. The archdiocese promptly issued a statement conveying their profound shock, urging for calm, and confirming the indefinite suspension of services at St. Gabriel's pending the outcome of the official investigation. What had commenced as a regrettable mishap was rapidly escalating into a criminal inquiry. Yet, behind the stark yellow tape, amidst the scattered splinters and stained vestments, a far more profound narrative was beginning to unfold. A story antecedent to the falling cross itself. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, a canine unit arrived, a standard procedure for significant property offenses. 2 police dogs, Milo and Roscoe, both adept in scent detection and locating human remains, were guided into the debris-strewn church. Then the situation took another unexpected turn. Roscoe came to an abrupt halt at the entrance to the confessional booth, a dark wooden enclosure erected in 1965, largely disused in recent times, yet still standing in the northeastern quadrant of the nave. The dog emitted a low growl, scratched once at the side panel, and then commenced barking with intense fervor. Milo joined him moments later, both dogs exhibiting an unwavering focus on the same unassuming section of paneling. Officers proceeded to pry open the rear wall. Concealed within a double layer of aged mahogany, they discovered a void. No larger than a microwave oven, it contained a canvas bag coated in dust and mildew. Its contents were destined to alter the course of everything. But in that initial moment, long before the DNA analyses, the examination of personnel files, and the impending media frenzy, there was only silence. Father Michael, still wearing a sling, stood a few feet away as the bag was opened. The sight that greeted him caused him to drop his prayer beads. Inside lay a fractured dagger, a scorched rosary, and a folded slip of paper, its surface stained and yellowed with age. "Forgive me, Joshua L., 1996. It was at that precise instant that Springfield grasped the truth. The cross had not fallen by accident. It had fallen to allow the truth to ascend. By nightfall, St. Gabriel's parish was no longer merely a place of worship. It had become an active crime scene. Brilliant floodlights cast stark shadows upon the stained glass windows, and uniformed officers established a perimeter around every entryway. Yellow tape stretched across the front steps where children had once played impromptu games of tag following Mass. Inside, the atmosphere felt unnaturally cold, not due to the weather, but from the palpable weight of suspicion. The official statement from the Springfield Police Department was released at 7:13 p.m. Preliminary findings indicate evidence of deliberate tampering. The collapse of the cross is currently being investigated as a potential act of sabotage. That solitary sentence was sufficient to ignite a wildfire of speculation throughout the city. The bolt that once secured the crucifix had been severed with clean precision, exhibiting no signs of rust or corrosion, only a stark, sharp, horizontal cut, as if a saw had been used to divide the very symbol of salvation. According to city engineer Rachel Knox, who conducted an inspection of the site, this was not the result of age or neglect. Someone possessed precise knowledge of its location and the means to sever it. Even more unsettling, the bolt had been concealed behind a stone relief panel, accessible only through a narrow maintenance crawl space located behind the altar, an area known to very few, let alone entered frequently. The critical question shifted from how it was done to who possessed the requisite knowledge to execute such an act. By the following morning, detectives commenced compiling a roster of individuals who had recently accessed restricted areas within the church. This included janitorial staff, sacristans, visiting volunteers, and even members of the clergy. However, there was no immediate indication of motive. No discernible grudges, no history of threats, no missing personnel, no prior instances of vandalism, only an unnerving quietude, save for one solitary voice. Father Thomas Weller, a retired priest aged 74. He had served at St. Gabriel's from 1985 to 2002. Upon viewing the news coverage, he contacted the police and left a brief, enigmatic message. Check the confessionals. Initially, his suggestion seemed cryptic, perhaps even bordering on paranoia. However, by that point, the K9 unit's alert had already guided investigators to the double-paneled wall behind the confessional booth. And once the bag was discovered, the entire investigation veered sharply into a more somber and personal territory. Within the confines of the downtown evidence room, the canvas bag was meticulously unpacked under the stark illumination of forensic lights. Inside lay a ceremonial dagger, its blade blackened and spotted with what appeared to be dried blood. A rosary, scorched and warped as if it had been subjected to intense heat and extinguished mid-prayer. And a small, folded piece of paper, fragile with age and bearing, faded handwriting. "Forgive me, Joshua L., 1996. The laboratory confirmed within hours that the stains were indeed blood, and despite the degradation, a sufficient quantity of DNA remained for testing. While full results would take several days, the implications were undeniably clear. This was not an act of random vandalism. It was a message, a confession. As the investigation broadened, cold case files from 1996 were quietly retrieved from the archives. There, within a forgotten folder labeled Missing Minor Non-Suspicious, was the name Joshua Lewis, aged 14. Last seen in June of that year, he had been serving as an altar boy at St. Gabriel's during the summer masses. His file contained no leads, no identified suspects, and no resolution, until this moment. At the parish, whispers began to circulate. Some parishioners spoke of the boy who vanished, recollections long suppressed beneath layers of religious observance and acts of mercy. Others recalled how deeply affected Father Michael had been by Joshua's disappearance years earlier. But at the time, no one had connected the events. No one had wanted to. Now, they had no alternative. Detective Carla Reynolds, assigned to the case, articulated the situation plainly during her press briefing. "We are treating this as a reopened homicide investigation. The collapse of the cross may have been orchestrated to facilitate the discovery of these items." This statement raised profound questions, not only regarding the fate of Joshua Lewis, but also concerning the identity of the individual who sought to expose the truth after nearly 3 decades. And, perhaps most hauntingly, the question of why now lingered. Was it remorse, a desire for retribution, a desperate plea for justice from someone who had once been part of their community? Or had the cross fallen, not solely due to sabotage, but under the immense weight of a secret that could no longer be contained? Regardless of the motive, one certainty emerged. This was not the conclusion. It was merely the beginning. The name Joshua Lewis held little significance for the younger congregants of St. Gabriel's parish. However, for those who had been present during the summer of 1996, it resonated like a somber toll from the past. A name that had once echoed through prayer halls, youth retreats, and Sunday school classrooms, only to disappear without a trace. Now, 28 years later, that name had resurfaced, imprinted on a blood-stained piece of paper, concealed within a wall, and unearthed by the keen senses of a police dog. It did not take long for the corresponding case file to be located. "Missing juvenile, no signs of foul play," read the prominent heading. According to the initial report, Joshua had failed to appear for the afternoon mass on June 14, 1996. The last individual to have seen him was a janitor who recalled Joshua sweeping near the sacristy that afternoon. That was the extent of the information. No witnesses, no indications of a struggle. His backpack remained inside his designated locker in the sacristy. The police conducted extensive searches of the surrounding neighborhood, local waterways, and adjacent woodlands. No body, no bloodstains were found. It was simply a disappearance that gradually faded into collective memory, until this present moment, the day following the discovery. Forensic analysts commenced the intricate process of DNA extraction from the blood discovered on the broken dagger found within the hidden compartment. The age of the sample rendered the procedure delicate, but the environment within the wooden wall, dry, insulated, and undisturbed, had preserved a sufficient quantity of biological material. Consequently, the Springfield Police Department made contact. Her name was Ruth Lewis, now in her late 60s, still residing in the same modest, single-story ranch house, located a mere 3 miles from St. Gabriel's. She answered the door, dressed in a cardigan and slippers, clutching a rosary in one hand, as if she had already anticipated the reason for their visit. "It's about my son," she stated, even before they had uttered a word. Detectives requested a DNA sample for comparative analysis. She insisted on providing it personally, without hesitation or tears, exhibiting a quiet fortitude honed by nearly 3 decades of enduring silence. Seated at her kitchen table, she whispered, "He was not the type to run away. He was destined to become a priest someday." When questioned about any suspicions she might have harbored at the time, she simply shook her head. No one, not even Father Michael. The laboratory results were available within 48 hours. a 99.998% match. The blood found on the dagger belonged to Joshua Lewis. The subsequent press conference was concise and understated. Detective Reynolds confirmed the DNA findings, but refrained from providing any further details regarding potential suspects. Behind the scenes, however, investigators were diligently reconstructing the final days of Joshua's life, piecing together memories and testimonies one by one. Old parish records were meticulously examined, including attendance logs, volunteer sign-in sheets, sermon notes, and even the church's archived sacristy schedule from 1996, preserved in a plastic bin within the rectory basement. It was then that a discrepancy was noted. One of the church secretaries first identified it. Joshua's altar service file had been altered. Under the entries for date of transfer and reason for exit, the spaces were left blank. There was no mention of him being reassigned, nor any official record of him ceasing his duties. It was as if he had been subtly expunged, not merely from the parish rolls, but from its collective memory. More disturbingly, the key to the crawl space behind the altar, the one necessary to access the bolts securing the crucifix, was documented as being entrusted to a single individual. Father Michael Torres, who at that time was newly appointed to St. Gabriel's, having been ordained less than 6 months prior. He was young then, charismatic, popular, and according to older parishioners, exceptionally close to Joshua. He treated that boy like his own son, one parishioner recalled, remembering how he would sit beside Joshua during youth choir rehearsals and teach him Latin verses after Mass. For years, this close bond was viewed without suspicion. Now, however, it was the subject of intense scrutiny. Detectives issued a subpoena for Father Michael's personal journals, but the contents revealed not evidence of a crime, but something far more intricate: guilt, profound grief, and an overwhelming sense of protective silence. In one journal entry, dated December 1998, he had written, "The cross is heavier than I had anticipated. Some transgressions require no vocal confession. They cry out through time regardless." Whether this stemmed from personal grief or complicity remained uncertain, but one fact was undeniable. The past, once buried, was now resurfacing, bleeding into the present, revealing truths, one name, one revelation at a time. The community, which had once fervently prayed for answers, was now confronted with a truth more profound and unsettling than any prayer could have prepared them for. The forensic results arrived just before dawn. Precisely at 5:12 a.m., the forensic unit based in Chicago uploaded a single-page report to the secure Springfield Police Department server. It contained no dramatic narrative, no sensational headlines, merely a string of alphanumeric codes, concluding with a final line at the bottom. Subject DNA matches maternal sample with 99.8% certainty. Identity confirmed. Joshua David Lewis, born May 5, 1982. For the detectives working the case, this was the moment they had simultaneously anticipated and dreaded. The boy was no longer merely a name. He was not just a rumor whispered in hushed tones from the pews or a faded photograph from a youth retreat bulletin board. He was the very blood found on the blade. Captain Ellison, the head of major crimes, gazed at the screen in silent contemplation for a full minute before summoning Detective Reynolds. Across town, Ruth Louie was already awake. She had not slept since the police officers had visited. She sat in her son's former bedroom, the walls still painted a soft blue, the name Josh still spelled out in wooden letters above the dresser. The same baseball glove rested nearby, as did a framed photograph of him adorned in a white cassock, holding a tall brass candle on the altar. When she received the phone call, she did not weep. Instead, she whispered, "I knew," and gently placed the phone back down onto the quilt beneath which he had once slept. Later that morning, Springfield Police convened a press conference outside City Hall. It was brief, with no suspects named and no arrests made, but the statement delivered by Chief Ellison struck the community like a silent thunderclap. We can now confirm that the blood found within the concealed panel at St. Gabriel's belongs to Joshua David Lewis, who was reported missing in June 1996. This case is now officially classified as a homicide. The words were clinical, yet their implication was devastating. At St. Gabriel's, the parish sign was draped in black fabric. Father Michael Torres remained out of the public eye that day. He had not been seen since the news broke. Some suggested he was remaining within the rectory, while others speculated that the diocese had discreetly relocated him. His silence was not conducive to clearing his name. Inside the church, there were no services, no candles lit, only dust, shafts of sunlight, and an abundance of unanswered questions. Why now? Why had the cross fallen after 28 years? Who knew about the location of the hidden evidence? And most disturbingly, who had hidden it in the first place? In the ensuing days, investigators redirected their attention back to the year 1996, meticulously examining church staff lists, weekly bulletins, and confession schedules. Nothing immediately pointed to guilt, but subtle details began to emerge. One record from May 1996 indicated that the confessional booth had undergone minor repairs. It was a footnote easily overlooked, but the carpenter hired for the work had never been compensated through parish accounts. His invoice was handwritten, marked cash only, with no surname provided on the receipt. Detective Reynolds began to suspect that the compartment behind the booth was not an accidental architectural feature, but rather an intentional construction designed to conceal something, or perhaps someone. A decision was made to employ ground-penetrating radar. The team would conduct scans beneath the confessional, as well as areas under the sacristy and the garden courtyard, in search of potential burial sites or hidden voids. Meanwhile, the Archdiocese of Chicago issued an internal directive, instructing all clergy to cooperate fully and provide any records they possessed from the 1990s. The message was unequivocal. The church wished to proactively address the situation. However, within the parish itself, a growing sense of unease prevailed. Some of the older parishioners, who recalled Joshua as a young boy, were now openly questioning Father Michael's past relationship with him, not with outright accusations, but with a haunting sense of uncertainty. "He was always so protective of Josh," one woman confided to reporters. "Sometimes I thought perhaps he was overly protective." One of the altar servers, who had worked alongside Joshua in the mid-90s, agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. He recounted a peculiar incident. "Josh once told me he knew a secret but couldn't tell anyone. He said it would ruin everything. I thought he was being dramatic. He wasn't." The truth, it seemed, had always been present, merely awaiting someone willing to listen. And now, with DNA serving as its witness and a broken blade as its voice, it was finally being heard, but answers invariably come at a cost. And in Springfield, the question that lingered persistently was this: what kind of secret could be so burdensome that it necessitated the dramatic fall of a cross to bring it to light? She arrived at St. Gabriel's Parish shortly after Ash Wednesday in the spring of 2024. Her name, listed on the volunteer roster, was L.B. McKinley. No middle name, no hometown provided. She selected the option for seasonal volunteer, specifically for Lenten services. Under contact information, she provided a prepaid phone number and indicated no fixed address. Most assumed she was a retiree passing through, one of many individuals seeking solace or absolution, or perhaps both, who found themselves in Springfield. She introduced herself simply as Linda. She maintained a reserved demeanor, sweeping the pews in the afternoons and assisting with the folding of bulletins. Occasionally, she would sit in the back row during evening prayer, her fingers tracing a set of rosary beads that appeared scorched at the edges, as if they had once survived a fire. No one felt compelled to inquire about their origin. Had they done so, Linda would have offered a polite smile and stated it was a lengthy tale. However, what remained unknown to everyone, including Father Michael, was that Linda McKinley had once used a different name, Lara Jennings. In the summer of 1995, she had been employed as a nurse at Mercy Hospital, and had briefly been involved in a relationship with Michael Torres. This was during his time as a seminarian, preparing for his ordination. The relationship concluded abruptly when he chose the path of priesthood. She left town, but certain events leave an indelible mark. Fast-forwarding nearly 3 decades, as news of Joshua Lewis's blood emerged, detectives began reviewing the profiles of anyone who had recently spent time at St. Gabriel's, with particular attention paid to those who had frequented the confessional area. It was during this process that Linda's name surfaced once more. She had volunteered for precisely 46 days before her sudden departure. There was no forwarding information, no farewell notice. She simply ceased appearing after Holy Saturday. However, the available security footage, though limited, presented a different narrative. On March the 27th, 2024, camera number 3, facing the East Corridor, captured Linda entering the nave shortly before noon. She paused near the old confessional, ran her fingers along the paneling, and remained seated in the last pew for over 20 minutes in silent contemplation. The subsequent day, she repeated the action, and the day after that. One custodian recalled a moment that now seemed imbued with an eerie significance. She was just standing there, he recounted, not crying, not praying, just looking at the wall as if it were alive. Detectives commenced tracing her history, starting with the name she had provided, L.B. McKinley. No relevant records were found, no tax filings, no utility accounts, no voter registration. However, an older DMV facial recognition scan matched her with a woman who had legally changed her name in 2001, shortly after a brief stay in a psychiatric clinic. Laura Jennings, the former girlfriend of Father Michael Torres. And in that moment, the disparate pieces of the puzzle began to align in a manner that no one had anticipated or desired. Father Michael had never mentioned her existence. When questioned by investigators, he confessed that decades had passed since he had last seen her, up until the year 2024. One afternoon, he recounted, she unexpectedly appeared after Mass, inquiring if she could assist with cleaning the nave. He recognized her instantly, but remained silent. He described her as appearing troubled, explaining his thought that she was seeking solace. And he firmly believed in the power of healing. He never informed the diocese, never reported the encounter, and never inquired about her return after such a long absence. However, others recalled her presence differently. Sister Eleanor, who managed the volunteer roster, stated that Linda would occasionally linger after everyone else had departed. The sister remembered that Linda never requested entry into the confessional, but she consistently remained nearby, as if awaiting someone or something. Then came the most peculiar detail of all. On Good Friday, shortly before she vanished, Linda had left a small card tucked between 2 hymnals. It bore no signature or accompanying message, only a crudely drawn illustration of a young boy holding a candle, standing beneath a lopsided wooden cross. Below it, a single sentence. Some prayers leave a scar. That was the last anyone saw of her until the cross toppled and the wall gave way. Now, her name, whatever it truly was, headed every investigative file. Not as a suspect, not yet, but as an apparition emerging from obscurity, bearing a burden too ancient to be forgotten and too dreadful to be interred. Whatever she had returned to confront, she left behind more than mere debris. She left a reckoning. The arrest was carried out discreetly. At a roadside motel along Highway 6 in central Missouri, agents from the United States Marshals Service knocked twice, waited, and then entered the unsecured room. Inside, Linda McKinley, formerly known as Laura Jennings, was seated on the edge of the bed with her legs crossed. Her suitcase was zipped, her hands clasped in her lap. She wore the same beige cardigan from her final days at St. Gabriel's. On the nightstand, a single item lay present. A faded black and white photograph of the 1996 Altar Server group, with Joshua Lewis prominently positioned at the forefront. She offered no resistance. She did not question the reason for her apprehension. Her sole utterance as they escorted her out was, "I knew someone would eventually hear him." At the Springfield Police Department, she waived her right to legal counsel. Without hesitation or negotiation, she offered the unvarnished truth. She delivered it in a tone so composed that it unsettled the officers tasked with documenting her statement. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she began, but something within me fractured. "The day I saw that boy." Her confession unfolded over a span of 6 hours. She recounted the summer of 1996. She explained how, after Father Michael prioritized his calling over her, she left town, changed her identity, and attempted to forge a new existence, but something within her had irrevocably broken. It was not merely a matter of heartache, but profound humiliation. In her own words, she had devoted herself entirely to a man who subsequently embraced celibacy and disappeared into clerical vestments. "I wasn't upset that he became a priest," she stated. "I was furious that he chose God as a means to erase me." Then, 3 years later, while traveling through Springfield on a Greyhound bus, she paused to rest at the only church she recognized, St. Gabriel's. It was there that she encountered him. Joshua, she noticed, was standing near the altar, carefully arranging candles. He looked to be about 13 or 14 years old. What drew her attention most was not his clothing, his age, or his expression. It was his apparent closeness to Father Michael. "He looked at him the way I once did," she whispered. And Father Michael, in turn, regarded him with a protective gaze. She admitted that she began visiting the church daily, pretending to pray, but instead quietly watching them, convinced that the boy had taken the place she once held in terms of trust and affection. "I felt invisible, replaced, as if even God himself had chosen a stronger version of me." She reached a breaking point on a Saturday evening, July 13th, 1996. She waited until the church was nearly deserted. Joshua had been requested to assist in tidying the confessional prior to the following morning's service. She approached him, posing as a woman in distress seeking to confess. He welcomed her with gentleness, adhering to his pastoral training. Within the confines of the booth, she produced a paring knife concealed within her coat sleeve, a utensil she had acquired from a diner earlier that day. And then, amidst the confined, silent darkness, she struck twice. He collapsed instantaneously, but a wave of panic ensued. She had not formulated a plan for what followed, only a primal fear. Consequently, she dragged his body behind the partition, accessed the rear panel, which was still partially dislodged due to ongoing repairs, and deposited the boy's remains and the weapon into the crawl space, along with a rosary she later incinerated and a note she hastily penned that same day. "Forgive me, Joshua L. 1996. She resecured the panel using borrowed implements, wiped her hands on her skirt, and departed into the twilight of the summer evening, akin to a phantom. When asked why she had never confessed previously, she replied, "Because no one ever looked for him." And I thought, perhaps that signified he was inconsequential. Her voice faltered only once throughout the entirety of her statement, when an officer presented her with a forensic photograph of Joshua's mother, Ruth Lewis, being informed of the DNA match. "I never intended to cause her pain," she conveyed. "I simply wish not to be forgotten." The concluding utterance of her confession was not committed to paper. It was voiced as officers prepared to transfer her to holding. She looked up at Detective Reynolds and inquired, "Do you believe he has forgiven me?" before succumbing to darkness. No one offered a reply, for none could. But it became unequivocally clear that night, Joshua Lewis had not been forgotten, nor had she. When the news emerged that Linda McKinley, formerly Lara Jennings, had confessed to the murder of Joshua Lua, every gaze in Springfield turned towards a single individual, Father Michael Torres. He was not taken into custody, nor was his name mentioned in any legal documentation. However, in the minds of many, he was already undergoing judgment, not for his actions, but for his omissions, for his silence. Initially, the Archdiocese released a meticulously crafted statement. Father Torres has cooperated fully with authorities and remains on administrative leave pending an internal review. But within the parish, words disseminated with greater speed than facts. Rumors spread like wisps of fragrant incense, pervasive, invasive, and difficult to disregard. Some asserted that he possessed complete knowledge of the events. Others claimed he knew just enough to be apprehensive. Yet few could dispute one incontrovertible fact. He had indeed recognized her. According to his own account provided to detectives during a private meeting at the Archdiocese offices, Father Michael admitted to having observed Linda McKinley months prior to the collapse of the cross. She attended Mass. One evening, he recalled, in late March. I recognized her the instant she entered the building. When questioned about his silence, his voice reportedly wavered. Because she appeared devastated, and because I still held faith that individuals could emerge from darkness. He maintained that she had never confessed any wrongdoing. She had not alluded to any culpability, yet she lingered excessively near the confessional. She frequented the old choir stalls with undue frequency, and at times, during late afternoon prayers, he would glance up and find her fixedly staring directly at him, unmoving. Nevertheless, he maintained his silence. Not out of apprehension of scandal, he asserted, but because he believed she was seeking absolution, not retribution. She brought back a form of melancholy that I believed I had long buried, he confided in his spiritual advisor. But I thought perhaps that melancholy was her burden to bear, not mine to reveal. Yet, when the cross ultimately fell, both literally and figuratively, he could no longer conceal his knowledge. Within a week of Linda's confession, Father Michael tendered his resignation from his position. The resignation was submitted without a press conference, without a sermon, and without a public apology. It consisted merely of a handwritten letter to the bishop stating, I cannot officiate at the altar with a compromised conscience. I have stepped aside, not due to culpability in her offense, but because I bear the weight of her silence and subsequently my own. The bishop accepted the resignation. No ecclesiastical charges were instituted. He was granted authorization to enter a monastic community in rural Oregon, where he would live in solitude, prayer, and silence. This was not a penance mandated by the church, but one he voluntarily chose for himself. This resolution did not satisfy everyone. Detective Carla Reynolds offered a candid assessment. He may not have committed the crime, but he deliberately concealed a portion of it under the guise of moral justification. Conversely, others held a differing perspective. Sister Miriam, a nun who had collaborated with Father Michael for nearly a decade, presented an alternative viewpoint. He did not shield her. He waited for her to reveal the truth, and perhaps that is the very essence of faith. To remain steadfast when the entire world demands action. Parishioners found themselves divided. Some filled the pews during his final Mass prior to his resignation. Others abstained from attending in protest. However, there was a universal consensus on one point. Father Michael Torres was irrevocably altered by these events. In the weeks following his departure, neighbors reported observing him walking the monastery grounds barefoot, clutching a scorched rosary remarkably similar to the one discovered within the wall alongside Joshua's bloodstains. One monk, who later spoke anonymously, shared an experience that deeply affected him. He kneels before the chapel cross each evening at precisely 9:46 p.m., the same time the crucifix collapsed at St. Gabriel's. He does not vocalize his prayers. He merely weeps. Was his reticence an act of cowardice or an expression of compassion? Did he withhold the truth to safeguard a perpetrator or to maintain hope for her salvation? Springfield would never provide definitive answers to these queries, not in its judicial proceedings nor in its religious pronouncements. But the man who had once proclaimed that grace resides in the interval between suffering and forgiveness had now stepped into that very interval himself, and it was uncertain if he would ever emerge. And so, as his name gradually receded from church bulletins and his voice faded from the pulpit, what lingered was a whispered narrative exchanged among the congregation. He did not conceal the truth. He anticipated its eventual arrival. The trial of Linda McKinley, a woman once recognized solely as a temporary church volunteer, commenced on July 8, 2025, in Clark County. Criminal Courtroom. 2A. While not the most highly publicized trial in the state, nor the most heinous crime documented, within that courtroom, 28 years of silence occupied the defendant's seat. She wore no cosmetics, no adornments. Her cardigan appeared as though it had been repeatedly folded and refolded for weeks. When the judge posed the question of whether she comprehended the charges, first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, desecration of remains, she simply nodded. She entered a plea of guilty. There would be no cross-examination, no jury deliberations, no unexpected witnesses, only a singular sentencing hearing in a courtroom densely populated with individuals who had previously encountered her in the parish hallways without ever truly knowing her identity. The prosecutor, Ada Julia Trent, articulated the case with stark clarity. Her case file comprised a mere 6 pages, as Linda had supplied the remaining details in her own handwriting and in her own words. "This is not a question of who," Trent stated. "It is a question of why." And even in her own account, the why is rooted in something more sinister than vengeance. It is rooted in possession. It is rooted in spiritual jealousy. It is a perverted craving for acknowledgement from someone who preferred the clerical collar to her. On the witness stand, Linda did not solicit leniency. "I took a child's life," she declared, "and then I existed as a spectral presence. I do not seek commiseration, I seek justice." Her statement was less than 5 minutes in duration. She never once directed her gaze towards the prosecution. She avoided looking at the public gallery, with the sole exception of a single instance. When Ruth Lewis, Joshua's mother, entered the room, accompanied by 2 parishioners for support, Linda's eyes briefly lifted, not with shame, not with recognition, but with a subdued quality, something akin to permission. Ruth did not speak during the hearing. She had submitted a single-page victim impact statement to the court in advance, which was subsequently read aloud by the judge. "I raised a child who aspired to be a priest, who held faith in forgiveness, and I am striving. God help me. I am endeavoring to forgive, yet I will never recover the lost birthdays, the missed Christmases, or the sound of his laughter echoing through the corridors of our home. What you deprived me of is beyond the purview of legal restitution. But if justice holds any significance, let it commence here." No tears or oars were shed. The room remained dry-eyed. Even the judge paused before delivering the sentence. "The court acknowledges the extraordinary circumstances surrounding this case. The passage of time does not diminish the horror of the crime, nor does it erase the profound impact of the loss. You have demonstrated remorse. You have not contested this legal process. Nevertheless, the court must act, not solely on behalf of the victim, but in testament to the truth." Linda McKinley received a sentence of 30 years in state prison with no possibility of parole. She blinked once, then whispered, "Thank you." Outside the courthouse, no protests erupted, no cameras flashed, merely a modest assembly of parishioners from St. Gabriel's, positioned behind a row of iron fencing, holding votive candles and murmuring Hail Marys under their breath. One among them, Deacon Thomas, later informed a local journalist, "This was not about punishment, this was about acknowledgement, and now, perhaps, Joshua can finally find repose." But justice, as it transpired, did not conclude with the imposition of the sentence. A week following the trial, Father Michael Torres, then residing in reclusion at a monastery in Oregon, dispatched a letter to the Louis family. It was concise, a single typed page, signed in ink. "I failed your son, not because I harmed him, but because I did not perceive the implicit warning within his silence. I comprehend this now, and I pray that God, in his boundless mercy, will one day permit Joshua to impart into my heart the words I never heard from his own lips." The letter was never returned. Whether Ruth ever read it remains unknown. However, one morning shortly thereafter, She was observed standing alone outside St. Gabriel's, clutching a folded letter in her hand. She lit a candle, took a seat in the third pew, and whispered words that no one could discern. Not an imprecation, not even a plea, simply the sound of a mother finally exhaling. It commenced with silence. For weeks following the sentencing, the St. Gabriel's parish remained quiescent. No bells chimed, no incense wafted, no bulletins were placed in the vestibule. The crucifix above the altar, which had been fractured during the collapse, had not been replaced. Only the raw stone wall remained, as if the very edifice was in mourning. Then arrived the scaffolding. On a Monday morning in August, trucks navigated the driveway. Carpenters clad in denim and reflective vests commenced unloading planks of hand-carved walnut, sourced from a monastery in New Mexico. A modest sign was affixed to the church doors. The cross will rise again. August 22nd. All are welcome. It marked the inaugural instance in nearly 3 months that anyone had dared to utter the word again. The new crucifix was taller than its predecessor, more unadorned, devoid of gilded accents or intricate carvings, featuring only wooden nails and a small brass plate at its base inscribed with a single sentence dedicated to the boy who waited in silence and the truth that liberated him. On the day of the rededication, the pews filled rapidly. Some faces had not been seen in years, others had never departed. A few remained skeptical, seated towards the rear, arms crossed, but no one left. The Mass was not officiated by Father Taus. Presiding in his stead was Father Gabriel Ruiz, a priest in his 40s with deeply set eyes and sleeves rolled above his elbows. He had been appointed discreetly by the archdiocese, without public fanfare or a press release. He arrived not in a black SUV, but walked from the rectory, carrying only a Bible and a towel to cleanse the altar before the commencement of Mass. In his inaugural homily, he made no mention of the trial, no reference to Father Michael, and no explicit naming of Joshua. Instead, he spoke of fractures, of certain breaks, and stated, "Do not shatter. They reveal what we were too apprehensive to acknowledge, and at times, that is where the healing originates." He paused, surveyed the congregation, and added, "We are not gathered here today to forget. We are here because we refuse to remain fractured." No applause followed, but heads bowed, some for the first time in years. At the conclusion of the Mass, Ruth Louis was graciously invited, quietly and without prior announcement, to place a small arrangement of white lilies at the base of the newly erected crucifix. She walked unaccompanied, her footsteps resonating on the polished stone. Upon reaching the cross, she did not kneel. She simply rested her hand on its base and whispered words that no microphone could capture. However, those seated closest reported hearing a smile in her voice. That evening, Father Gabriel hosted an open forum in the parish hall, not as a lecture, but as an exercise in attentive listening. Parishioners arrived bearing their grief, their anger, their guilt. "I sensed that something was amiss back then," confessed an elderly gentleman, tears tracing paths down his cheeks. "But I did not inquire. I simply continued to attend." "I lost faith in this place," declared another woman. "But perhaps I was waiting for someone to extend an invitation for my return." Father Gabriel listened without interruption, offering no justifications. By the evening's close, the bulletin board was adorned with handwritten sentiments. For Joshua, for Michael, for the years we were afraid to speak, for forgiveness, commencing now. And thus, the church embarked on a new chapter. New initiatives were introduced. Youth programs with open-door policies, mental health services for families navigating bereavement, and a scholarship fund established as the Joshua Louis Initiative, providing financial assistance for altar server education to children from underserved communities. The stained glass window, shattered during the collapse, was replaced not with depictions of saints or symbolic figures, but with a minimalist design. A candle casting light in the darkness, and a small boy holding the illumination. Beneath it, no name was etched, only 3 words: "He is seen." In time, the pews filled once more. The choir's voices resounded again, and the bells chimed, not because the narrative had been obliterated, but because the individuals within had chosen to carry it forward. Not every wound completely vanishes. Some persist, but so too do those who remember. And through this act of remembrance, they reconstituted their church. In the weeks that ensued following the restoration of St. Gabriel's parish, a peculiar phenomenon began to unfold. Individuals arrived not solely for prayer, but to commemorate. Teenagers who had never known Joshua Louis sat in quiet contemplation within the pews, their mobile devices switched off. Long-standing parishioners, once too deeply wounded to return, now arrived punctually to light candles. The silence that had previously resonated with unspoken guilt had transformed into a sanctuary of grace. Beyond the church walls, the external world continued its progression. Headlines faded, reporters gathered their equipment, Linda McKinley's name receded from trending search queries. Father Michael's current whereabouts remained unconfirmed. Nevertheless, within Springfield, and more profoundly within the hearts of those who had experienced this unfolding story, the truth adamantly refused to dissipate. Because truth, once finally articulated, does not merely dissipate the tension, it illuminates the pathway forward. Father Gabriel, now several months into his understated leadership, maintained a handwritten journal concealed within his desk. One afternoon, he shared a singular passage from it with a grieving mother who had recently lost her son to addiction. There are 3 essential lessons I have gleaned from this sanctuary. Firstly, faith does not serve as an impenetrable shield against suffering. Secondly, truth possesses the power to shatter you, yet it will never deceive. And thirdly, forgiveness is not the act of closing a door, it is the conscious decision to maintain the door ajar. Even after the tempest had passed, she offered no verbal response. However, the following day, she returned, accompanied by her daughter, and assisted in serving meals at the parish soup kitchen. Within the community, healing manifested in subtle, imperceptible ways. A young boy who had previously ridiculed altar servers now enrolled to serve himself. A woman who had not entered a confessional in 2 decades entered without uttering a word, and emerged with tears streaming down her cheeks. A police officer who had played a crucial role in recovering the concealed evidence donated an entire year's salary to establish scholarships for students in underprivileged urban areas. Forgiveness did not arrive as a singular, sweeping gesture. It unfolded in layers, through written correspondence, through embraces exchanged without explanation, through shared glances directed at the stained glass candle window that now glowed each dusk, illuminated by the sun's rays. As for Ruth Louis, she made no further public pronouncements. She simply returned each Sunday, occupied the same pew, and offered a quiet prayer before the commencement of Mass. No one dared to inquire about the content of her prayers, but a child seated behind her one day claimed to have heard her speak aloud, "I still miss you, but I am no longer angry." The child's mother dismissed it as fabrication until she observed the gentle smile that graced Ruth's face when she turned around. And somewhere in Oregon, nestled amidst towering redwoods and perpetual fog, a man formerly known as Father Michael tended a small garden behind the monastery walls. He no longer delivered sermons. He had ceased to pen words. Yet each night, precisely at 9:46 in the evening, a solitary candle would be kindled within the hallowed chapel. There, he would assume a kneeling posture before the sacred crucifix, uttering those selfsame 5 phrases. "I apologize. I recall him." No one had compelled him to perform this ritual. However, perhaps this is the very essence of devotion, not absolute certainty, nor protection from hardship, but rather the resolve to remain when others flee, to voice truth when others murmur, and to hold on to hope against all odds. The conviction that this unfolding narrative has not reached its conclusion, for in truth it never truly does. Veracity will invariably bide its time, and divine favor will unfailingly locate those who humble themselves, even if their arrival is delayed. Therefore, if you have persevered until the close of this account, navigating through the descent, the bloodshed, the profound quietude, and the inevitable consequences, you have witnessed something uncommon. A collective that opted not to evade its suffering, but to confront it directly. A spiritual body that remained steadfast when its foundational symbol faltered. A maternal figure who offered absolution when retribution arrived past its opportune moment. A clergyman who relinquished his platform to recover his inner self. A locale that grasped the most revolutionary sentiment one can articulate following an admission of fault. I still have faith. And perchance, just perchance, this is the manifestation of being touched by divine mercy. Thank you for your attention. Should this narrative resonate with you, please subscribe to our channel, Touched by Grace, for additional authentic accounts of reclamation, mending, and an unwavering spirit. For in a world awash with clamor, these are the tales that resonate most powerfully. Subscribe, contemplate, disseminate.